For decades, popular science writing loved to describe one particular group of people using the same tantalizing phrase over and over again: a living genetic time capsule. A population supposedly frozen in place since the earliest days of human migration out of Africa, untouched by tens of thousands of years of mixing, conquest, and cultural change that reshaped nearly every other population on Earth. It made for an irresistible headline. It also turns out to be considerably less accurate than most of those headlines ever let on. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean sits a small forested island roughly the size of Manhattan, ringed by coral reefs and defended by people who have met nearly every outside visitor in recorded history with a hail of arrows fired from the tree line. The island is North Sentinel, part of India's Andaman Islands, and the people who live there are known as the Sentinelese. For years, their deep ancestry was treated almost as settled fact, a single unbroken genetic thread reaching back to the very first wave of humans who ever left Africa. Newer, more rigorous genetic research tells a considerably more complicated and honestly more interesting story. Before getting into what changed, it's worth being completely clear about something the popular version of this story often glosses over. No scientist has ever collected genetic material directly from a living Sentinelese individual. Nobody speaks their language. Nobody has had a sustained, peaceful conversation with them in the entire span of recorded history. Every documented attempt at contact, from 19th century colonial expeditions to organized anthropological visits in the 1970s and 80s, has ended the same way, with the visiting boat retreating and the island's inhabitants making their wishes unmistakably clear. The Indian government today enforces strict laws prohibiting anyone from approaching North Sentinel Island, both to protect its residents from diseases they have no immunity to, and to respect a wish for isolation that has been expressed consistently and unambiguously for as long as anyone has been keeping records. Because of this, everything researchers believe about Sentinelese ancestry comes from indirect evidence. Genetic studies of their closest relatives among the wider Andamanese population, archaeological research across the islands, and broader models tracing how early humans spread out of Africa. That distinction matters enormously for what comes next because it explains exactly where the old, simpler story started to break down. The original version of the story goes like this. Somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years ago, a relatively small population of modern humans left Africa and began spreading outward across Asia, eventually reaching Europe, Australia, and every other inhabited continent. According to this model, the ancestors of the Andamanese, including the presumed ancestors of the Sentinelese, split off extremely early from this migration, following a coastal route along the southern edge of Asia and settling in the Andaman Islands, before nearly everyone else had even left the African continent's general vicinity. Because their descendants then apparently remained isolated for tens of thousands of years afterward, this population was framed as a kind of genetic snapshot, preserving traits and ancestry from one of the very earliest chapters of the human story, essentially untouched by everything that happened afterward. It's a compelling story, and for a while it was the dominant one. If you've ever heard the Andamanese described as one of the purest or oldest surviving human lineages on Earth, that's this exact framing at work. And it's exactly the kind of claim that more rigorous, more recent genetic analysis has substantially complicated. If you find it fascinating how quickly a widely repeated scientific narrative can unravel once researchers start comparing it against harder, more direct evidence, that's precisely the pattern playing out here. Go ahead and hit that like button because the actual data tells a noticeably different story than the one that's been circulating in documentaries for years. The complication starts with ancient DNA recovered from mainland Southeast Asia, a resource that simply wasn't available to earlier generations of researchers working primarily with modern genetic samples and broad migratory models. When researchers compared genetic material from ancient skeletal remains found across Southeast Asia against modern Andamanese genomes, they found something the old isolated since the earliest migration story didn't fully account for. Andamanese populations show a close genetic relationship to prehistoric populations connected to what archaeologists call the Hoabinhian culture, an ancient hunter-gatherer tradition that spread widely across mainland Southeast Asia and persisted there for thousands of years. This finding pushes back meaningfully against the idea that Andamanese ancestry represents some kind of untouched relic from the very earliest wave of human migration out of Africa, arriving in the islands the moment humans first reached South Asia. Instead, it suggests something more specific and, in its own way, more interesting. The Andaman Islands were likely populated by people connected to this broader Southeast Asian hunter-gatherer world sometime around 16 to 20,000 years ago, a period when global sea levels sat considerably lower than they do today, narrowing the water gap between the islands and the mainland enough to make crossing meaningfully more feasible than it would be now. Rather than descending from one of the absolute earliest splinter groups to leave Africa, Andamanese ancestry appears to represent one regional branch within a broader, somewhat later Southeast Asian population, one that then became isolated after sea levels rose again and cut the islands off from the mainland. That's a real, substantive correction to the earlier picture, not just a minor tweak in dating. It moves the story of Andamanese isolation from something framed as nearly as old as the out-of-Africa migration itself to something considerably more recent, still remarkably ancient by any reasonable standard, but tied to a different, more specific chapter of Southeast Asian prehistory rather than functioning as a direct, unbroken snapshot of the very first humans to leave Africa. None of this means the earlier genetic research was fabricated or careless. Some of the original evidence for very deep Andamanese ancestry came from mitochondrial DNA studies identifying ancient lineages, including branches of the M haplogroup, estimated to have entered the Andaman Islands somewhere between 26,000 and 37,000 years ago. That dating still places Andamanese maternal lineages among some of the older continuously documented branches found in South Asia. What changed isn't that this data was wrong. What changed is that researchers gained access to a much richer comparative data set, actual ancient DNA recovered directly from mainland Southeast Asian sites, rather than relying primarily on modern genetic samples run through broader migratory models. That additional evidence painted a more specific, more regionally grounded picture than the original framing allowed for, and in science, that's exactly how a more accurate understanding is supposed to replace an earlier, less complete one. Outsiders, passed down through oral tradition after witnessing or hearing about, the if uncovering how new evidence quietly overturns comfortable, long-repeated scientific narratives, fascinates you. Make sure you're subscribed, because this exact pattern shows up again and again throughout the story of human genetics. This scientific correction also connects to something researchers have increasingly emphasized when studying isolated populations more broadly: a growing recognition that genetic isolation and genetic antiquity are not actually the same thing, even though popular science writing frequently treats them as interchangeable. A population can be genuinely, remarkably isolated, cut off from outside genetic mixing for many thousands of years, without necessarily representing the absolute earliest possible branch of the broader human migration story. The Andamanese case illustrates this distinction clearly. Their isolation is real, well documented, and genuinely unusual by global standards. Their status as some kind of pristine, earliest possible genetic snapshot of the original out-of-Africa migration is the part that more recent evidence has significantly walked back. This distinction matters for another reason too, one with real ethical weight attached to it. Framing a living population as a genetic time capsule, however well-intentioned, can subtly reduce actual living people to a kind of scientific artifact, valuable primarily for what their DNA might reveal about ancient history rather than being understood as a contemporary community with its own culture, autonomy, and right to self-determination. Researchers studying isolated indigenous populations today have become considerably more attentive to this framing problem than earlier generations of anthropologists were, and the correction to the Andamanese origin story fits into that broader shift as well. It's not just that the timeline needed adjusting, it's that the entire living fossil framing itself deserved more scrutiny than it originally received. It's worth pausing on the wider Andamanese picture for a moment, because the Sentinelese aren't the only group whose story this genetic reassessment touches. Groups like the Onge and the Jarawa, both living elsewhere in the Andaman archipelago, are considerably more accessible to researchers than the Sentinelese, and it's genetic material from these closely related populations that forms the actual backbone of most conclusions about deep Andamanese ancestry. The Onge, in particular, have seen their own population decline dramatically over the past century, dropping from several hundred individuals to just around 100. Today, largely due to disease, displacement, and the same broad pattern of demographic disruption that has affected indigenous populations across the region following outside contact. Studying their genomes carries its own ethical weight, since even willing participation from a small, historically vulnerable population raises legitimate questions about informed consent, benefit sharing, and whether genetic research adequately serves the interests of the community being studied rather than existing primarily to satisfy outside scientific curiosity. Modern research protocols increasingly require these considerations to be addressed directly, with local communities meaningfully involved in decisions about how their genetic material is used and what, if anything, they gain from participating in that research. This broader context also helps explain why the 2018 killing of an American missionary who illegally traveled to North Sentinel Island attracted such intense global attention. The incident wasn't simply a tragic, isolated news story. It became a flashpoint for exactly the tension this entire narrative revolves around: the friction between outside curiosity, whether religious, scientific, or simply adventurous, and a population's clearly and repeatedly demonstrated wish to be left alone. Indian authorities ultimately declined to pursue charges against the Sentinelese themselves, citing the impossibility of prosecuting a community that has never recognized, agreed to, or been meaningfully informed about the laws of the country that technically claims jurisdiction over their island. The case reinforced, in the clearest possible terms, exactly why researchers today approach questions about Sentinelese ancestry entirely through indirect evidence, never through direct contact, regardless of how many scientific questions remain unanswered as a result. Now, here's where the deeper, more human layer of this story comes into focus, because understanding why the Sentinelese specifically maintain such consistent, sustained resistance to outside contact requires looking at what happened to their closest regional relatives. Before sustained British colonial contact began during the 19th century, the wider Great Andamanese population is estimated to have numbered in the many thousands, spread across multiple distinct communities throughout the Andaman archipelago. Following sustained contact with British colonial settlers, introduced diseases, including measles, influenza, and syphilis, devastated these populations catastrophically. Today, the collective descendants of what were once numerous distinct Great Andamanese communities number fewer than 40 individuals total, according to recent population surveys, representing one of the most severe population collapses recorded anywhere in modern history. This tragedy, unfolding a relatively short distance from North Sentinel Island itself, offers a genuinely compelling explanation for why the Sentinelese have maintained such consistent hostility toward outside contact across so many generations. While there's obviously no way to directly confirm this reasoning, given the complete absence of shared language or sustained communication, many researchers studying the region's broader historical context believe the Sentinelese may carry forward generations of cultural memory and learned wariness toward catastrophic fate that befell their genetic and cultural relatives elsewhere throughout the islands. Seen this way, their sustained resistance looks considerably less like unexplained aggression and considerably more like an extremely effective, deeply learned survival strategy, one that has successfully protected their population's health, autonomy, and distinct way of life for well over a century, during a period when virtually every other comparable population throughout the region suffered catastrophic decline following sustained outside contact. It's also worth walking through, briefly, exactly how researchers arrive at dating estimates like these, because it explains why the numbers themselves have shifted somewhat as methods improved. Genetic dating relies heavily on something called a molecular clock, the idea that mutations accumulate in DNA at a roughly predictable rate over generations, allowing researchers to estimate how long ago two populations diverged from a common ancestor by measuring how many genetic differences have built up between them. Early estimates of Andamanese divergence relied on comparing modern genetic samples against broad, generalized mutation rate assumptions, calibrated primarily from other, better-studied populations. As researchers gathered larger comparative datasets, including actual ancient DNA rather than only modern samples, and refined mutation rate calibrations specific to South and Southeast Asian populations, the resulting divergence estimates shifted meaningfully. This is a completely normal part of how molecular dating improves over time, but it means that a specific number published in one study, whether it's 60,000 years or 20,000 years, should always be understood as a current best estimate rather than a permanently fixed fact, subject to revision as better calibration data and larger comparative samples become available. There's also something worth understanding about exactly how researchers study population relationships like this without direct sampling, since it explains why scientific conclusions here always come with some built-in uncertainty. Population geneticists rely on comparative analysis, examining genetic markers among closely related, more accessible populations, and then applying established mathematical models of population divergence and migration timing to draw statistically grounded inferences about groups that cannot safely be sampled directly. This approach is inherently less precise than direct sequencing, and it's exactly why new comparative datasets like ancient DNA from mainland Southeast Asia can meaningfully shift the picture even without ever touching a single Sentinelese genome directly. The conclusions researchers draw about the Sentinelese specifically are always, necessarily, an extrapolation from their nearest documented relatives, filtered through whatever comparative evidence happens to be available at the time. This is precisely why claims about deeply isolated populations deserve a degree of built-in humility that headline-driven science writing doesn't always provide. A finding framed as settled fact in one decade can look considerably more provisional once a new comparative dataset becomes available the next. Not because the earlier researchers were sloppy, but because population genetics is a field that improves incrementally, one new sample and one new comparative dataset at a time. So what should we actually take away from this updated, more accurate version of the story? The Sentinelese and their closest Andamanese relatives are not, as far as current evidence suggests, some untouched relic of the very first human migration out of Africa, preserved in isolation since the dawn of our species' journey across the planet. They appear instead to descend from a somewhat later, still remarkably ancient branch of Southeast Asian hunter-gatherer ancestry, one that reached the islands during a period of lower sea levels and then became isolated as the waters rose again, cutting them off from the mainland for many thousands of years afterward. That's a meaningfully different story than the genetic time capsule framing that circulated for years. And it's a story grounded in considerably stronger comparative evidence than the version it replaced. It hasn't changed, and what may honestly be the more important part of this entire story is the remarkable, well-documented reality of their isolation itself and the reasons behind their determination to protect it. Whether their ancestry traces back 60,000 years or 20,000 years changes the specific chapter of prehistory they connect to. But it doesn't change the fact that they represent one of the most sustained, deliberately protected examples of cultural and genetic separation found anywhere on the planet, nor does it change the devastating historical precedent, written in the population collapse of their closest relatives, that fully explains why they've chosen to protect that separation so fiercely. The real story of the Sentinelese and the wider Andamanese population isn't any less remarkable for being more complicated. If anything, understanding it more precisely as one specific, well-documented branch within the broader story of ancient human migration across Southeast Asia, rather than as a mythologized snapshot of humanity's very first steps out of Africa, makes their story more scientifically grounded and arguably more respectful of who they actually are, rather than less. There's a broader lesson embedded here too, one that applies well beyond this single island. Popular science stories about ancient, isolated populations tend to reach for the most dramatic possible framing, the oldest lineage, the purest genetic snapshot, the living fossil frozen in time because that framing is simply easier to compress into a headline or a documentary tagline than a more careful, regionally specific account ever could be. Actual population genetics is messier than that, built from partial, indirect evidence, regional comparisons, and models that get refined as better data becomes available. It's also worth noting that this same pattern of revision keeps showing up across other supposedly isolated or ancient populations studied around the world, from remote Siberian groups to isolated communities in the Amazon basin, each time following a similar arc: an initial dramatic framing based on limited comparative data, followed by a more precise, more regionally grounded picture once additional ancient DNA samples and refined statistical models become available. The Sentinelese story isn't an isolated case of scientific overreach being corrected. It's one clear example of a pattern that runs throughout the entire field of population genetics, a field defined less by single, permanent discoveries than by continuous refinement as the available comparative evidence steadily improves. Somewhere out on that small, forested island, a community continues living largely by its own choice, protected by law, defended by its own long memory, and now understood by science with considerably more precision than the older, catchier version of their story ever allowed for. That's not a less interesting ending than the one about a living genetic time capsule. It's simply a more honest one, and in population genetics, as in most fields of science, the honest version is usually the one worth actually telling.